Picture this midnight in ancient Greece, deep within a hidden grove where torchlight flickers against olive trees. A group of robed figures gathers in hushed reverence, their faces obscured by masks carved to resemble deities. The air is thick with the scent of burning myrrh and crushed laurel leaves as they chant in a language long forgotten words believed to summon the gods themselves. This wasn't just a ceremony, it was a gateway to the divine, a ritual so secret that revealing its details could mean death. Welcome to the shadowy world of Greek mystery cults, where initiation rites defied logic, devotion bordered on obsession, and the line between mortal and God blurred into something terrifying and intoxicating. These cults weren't fringe groups, they were the beating heart of spiritual life for thousands, offering promises no mainstream religion could: direct encounters with the divine, secrets of the afterlife, and powers beyond human understanding. But to earn these gifts, initiates endured trials that would make modern minds reel, from hallucinogenic brews that transported them to other realms, to sacred dramas where they became the gods they worshipped. Some practices were so extreme, so bizarre, that even ancient writers dared only whisper about them, and that's what makes these cults so magnetic centuries later. They weren't just rituals, they were revolutions against fear, against the unknown, against the very limits of what it meant to be human. Today, we're pulling back the veil on 30 of the strangest, most mesmerizing practices from these clandestine groups. Why did worshippers drink potions made from poisonous plants? What happened in the blood-soaked ceremonies dedicated to goddesses of the underworld? And how did these rites shape the course of Western history, from philosophy to science to the secret societies that still operate among us? The answers lie in broken artifacts, fragmented texts, and the eerie echoes of chants that still seem to linger in ruins. So if you're ready to step into the torchlight and uncover what these ancient seekers died to protect, let's begin. Just remember, some secrets once heard cannot be unheard. The first ritual that defies modern understanding takes us to Eleusis, a small town near Athens where the most famous mystery cult of antiquity unfolded. Here, initiates drank a sacred brew called Kykeon, a deceptively simple mixture of barley and water that held the power to shatter the boundaries of perception. But this was no ordinary meal. Scholars now suspect the barley was contaminated with ergot, a fungus containing compounds strikingly similar to LSD. Imagine drinking a cup of liquid visions where the walls between worlds dissolved into swirling colors and divine whispers. The experience wasn't random chaos, it was carefully choreographed. After days of fasting and chanting in torch-lit halls, the Kykeon acted as a key, unlocking what initiates called the epopteia, the moment of ultimate revelation. Some described walking through fields of golden light, others claimed to hold conversations with Demeter and Persephone themselves. The most striking accounts tell of vanishing entirely, becoming one with the universe, as if the gods had peeled back the curtain of reality. Yet the true genius of the ritual wasn't just the visions, it was the deception. By presenting the drink as humble peasant fare, the priests ensured only the worthy would experience its full power. Those unprepared might dismiss it as a mild tonic, while true believers, primed by days of ritual, found themselves hurtling into the divine. This duality made the Eleusinian mysteries irresistible for nearly 2,000 years, drawing emperors and slaves alike to its secret rites. Even Socrates reportedly took the vow of silence, leaving us to wonder, what did he see that was too profound for words? Now imagine holding an egg not as food, but as the very seed of the universe. For followers of the Orphic mysteries, this wasn't metaphor, it was sacred truth. Their rituals revolved around the cosmic egg, a shimmering symbol of creation cracked open in ceremonies so secret, even most ancient Greeks knew only whispers. This wasn't just mythology brought to life. Initiates believed that by handling the egg painted with constellations and whispered over for nights, they were touching the same primal force that birthed the gods. The ritual reenacted the moment when Phanes, the first deity, hatched from the void, bringing light to chaos. But here's where it twists. The Orphics tied this cosmic birth to Dionysus's gruesome death and rebirth. During initiations, priests would place the egg in the candidate's palms, guiding them to chant verses about Dionysus being torn apart by titans, only to be reborn from the egg's divine yolk. Some texts hint at initiates smearing their faces with egg and ash, becoming twice born like the god himself. What made this ritual explosive was its defiance of normal Greek religion. While temples offered prayers to distant Olympians, the Orphics promised something radical, that by holding the egg, you weren't just worshipping creation, you were reclaiming your own divinity, piece of the original cosmic spark still glowing inside every soul. Archaeologists have found thin gold leaves buried with Orphic followers, inscribed with directions for the afterlife, proof that these egg rituals weren't theater. They were passports to eternity, written in yolk and starlight. The night air trembled with the sound of drums as torches cast jagged shadows through the forest. Followers of Dionysus moved in a pulsing circle, their breaths ragged, their eyes wide with something beyond madness ecstasy. This was no ordinary gathering. It was the sparagmos, a ritual so visceral it blurred the line between worship and possession. When the frenzy reached its peak, they fell upon a living bull, tearing it apart with nothing but their hands, consuming its raw flesh as if swallowing the god's power itself. But why such brutality? To the Bacchae, Dionysus's most devoted followers, this wasn't mere violence. It was sacred theater. The sparagmos reenacted the myth of the god's childhood, when titans ripped him limb from limb before he was reborn. By mirroring this act, initiates believed they could shatter their own mortal limits, becoming vessels for Dionysus's untamed spirit. The bull wasn't just an animal, it was a stand-in for the god, and by devouring it, they absorbed his essence. Ancient writers like Euripides left chilling accounts of these rites in the Bacchae, where women normally barred from public life, transformed into feral beings, overpowering armed men with supernatural strength. Some texts suggest these frenzies spiraled beyond animals. Fragmentary scrolls whisper of participants turning on human victims, though whether these were willing initiates or outsiders who stumbled upon the rituals remains one of antiquity's darkest mysteries. What's most unsettling is how calculated the chaos was. The sparagmos always followed a precise sequence, days of dancing to exhaustion, intoxication from wine mixed with hallucinogenic herbs, and finally the tearing, a crescendo of blood and revelation. Modern scholars compare it to extreme spiritual adrenaline, shocking the body into transcendent states. The raw flesh, consumed without fire, was thought to carry the mana of life undiluted by civilization's touch. Yet beneath the horror lay a profound rebellion. In a world bound by strict social roles, these frenzies offered temporary anarchy. Slaves became equals, women wielded power, and the rigid order of Greek society dissolved into primal unity. For a single night, the cultists didn't just worship Dionysus, they were him. And when dawn came, they returned to their daily lives, carrying a secret knowledge in their blood-stained hands. That divinity wasn't just above them. It was in the scream, the tear, the taste of copper on the tongue. Hidden beneath the laughter and torchlight of an autumn festival, a secret far darker than modern minds might expect unfolded each year across Greece. The Thesmophoria, a sacred rite barred to all men under penalty of death, centered on a ritual so visceral it bound the fertility of the land to the decomposition of flesh. Women carried piglets into underground chambers called megara, where the animals were left to rot for months alongside pine branches and dough shaped like genitalia. When the time came, priestesses retrieved the remains, now blackened and stinking, to mix with seeds before sowing. This wasn't mere superstition. It was alchemy of the most primal kind, death transformed into life through a process so taboo, even discussing it openly was forbidden. The genius of the ritual lay in its layers. On the surface, it mirrored agricultural cycles, decay nourishing new growth, but the piglets held deeper symbolism. Pigs were sacred to Demeter, their prolific litters embodying abundance. By offering them to the earth, participants enacted a brutal pact: surrender life to sustain life. Ancient sources describe how the women, normally excluded from civic religion, became conduits of divine power during these rites. They fasted, told obscene jokes to provoke laughter, itself a fertility charm, and reenacted Demeter's grief for Persephone. The rotting flesh wasn't just fertilizer, it was a relic of the goddess's pain, a sacred decay that promised resurrection. What shocks modern scholars isn't the ritual's grotesquerie, but its precision. The piglets had to be virgin souls, their purity ensuring no contamination of the sacred decay. The megara chambers weren't random pits, they symbolized Persephone's underworld, and accessing them required crawling through narrow tunnels, a physical rebirth as women emerged clutching the remains. Even the timing was calculated. The festival coincided with autumn planting, threading the ritual into the fabric of survival. Most revolutionary was the total absence of men. In a society where women's roles were tightly controlled, the Thesmophoria handed them unchecked authority. Men who dared spy on the rites risked execution. Stories tell of offenders being bludgeoned with ritual objects. This inversion wasn't chaos, it was sacred theater. For 3 days, women held the fate of the harvest in their hands, and by extension, the survival of the polis. The message was clear. Beneath Greece's patriarchal surface pulsed an older truth that the line between life and death was held by those who bled, birthed, and buried. Archaeologists have found terracotta piglets in the Thesmophoria sanctuaries, their bodies studded with votive offerings, tiny breasts, wombs, sheaves of grain. These weren't mere tokens, they were maps of a worldview where fertility wasn't abstract prayer, but something you dug from the earth with bare hands, something that smelled of sacrifice and sang with flies. The festival's power endured for centuries because it acknowledged a truth modernity often forgets. Creation isn't tidy, it's messy, bloody, and steeped in the scent of things returning to the soil so new life can begin. The drums pounded like a fevered heartbeat as the new initiate stumbled forward, his face slick with sweat under the moon's cold gaze. Before him lay the sacred flint knife, its edge honed sharp enough to slice through flesh and fate in a single stroke. This was no ordinary sacrifice. For the Galli, priests of the goddess Cybele, devotion demanded the ultimate surrender, not just of possessions or pride, but of manhood itself. With a scream that echoed through the temple precinct, the blade fell, severing more than flesh. It was an act so extreme even other Greeks recoiled, yet for these worshippers it was the only path to true divinity. Cybele wasn't just a goddess, she was the Great Mother, a primordial force of nature who demanded absolute union with her followers. Her myth held the key to the ritual's brutal logic. Her beloved Attis, driven mad by her power, castrated himself beneath a pine tree and bled out, only to be reborn as her eternal companion. The Galli reenacted this myth with terrifying literalism. After days of frenzied dancing to the shrill cry of flutes, initiates would enter a trance-like state, sometimes aided by opium or wine. Then, in a burst of ecstatic agony, they'd mimic Attis's sacrifice, often hurling their severed flesh onto Cybele's altar like an offering. But here's where it defies modern assumptions. This wasn't seen as mutilation. It was transcendence. By shedding their masculinity, the Galli symbolically died to the mortal world and were reborn as something neither man nor woman but sacred. They dressed in flowing gowns, wore their hair long, and became living vessels of Cybele's power. Roman accounts describe them roaming the streets in ecstatic processions, their robes stained with sanguis, not just blood but sacred sap, the life force of the earth itself. The ritual's aftermath was just as calculated. New Galli were forbidden to enter Cybele's inner sanctum until their wounds healed, a period mirroring Attis's 3 days in the underworld. When they emerged, they donned the polos, a towering crown symbolizing their rebirth into divine service. Their castration wasn't an end, it was a threshold. No longer bound by human desires, they became conduits for Cybele's wild, untamable energy. What unsettled contemporary observers wasn't just the violence, but the reversal of Greek values. In a culture that prized masculine strength, the galleys' rejection of manhood was revolutionary, yet their power was undeniable. Statesmen consulted them, armies sought their blessings, and even skeptics whispered that their prophecies came true. A first-century inscription from Rome praises a Gallus named Dionysus for holding the goddess's voice in his throat, suggesting these eunuch priests could channel Cybele's will directly. Archaeologists have uncovered tiny silver razors in Cybele's shrines, some still etched with dried blood. But the most haunting relics are the terracotta votives, crude figurines of men holding knives to their genitals, their faces twisted not in pain but rapture. These weren't warnings, they were invitations for those brave or desperate enough to seek the goddess's embrace. The price of divinity was written in flesh and flame. And to the galley, that price was no sacrifice at all. It was freedom. Deep beneath the streets of Rome, in windowless chambers called Mithria, initiates gathered around an altar where the air smelled of damp stone and old blood. At the center of every sanctuary stood the same eerie tableau, our young god Mithras plunging a dagger into the neck of a massive bull. This was no simple decoration. The tauroctony, or bull-slaying scene, was the heart of a mystery cult that rivaled early Christianity, its rituals so potent they left veterans and emperors trembling. But why a bull? The answer lies in the stars. Every element of Mithras's act mirrored constellations, the bull as Taurus, the dog as Canis Minor, the scorpion as Scorpio. When initiates traced their fingers over these carvings by torchlight, they weren't just seeing a myth. They were touching a celestial map, one that promised liberation through the bull's death. Ancient texts describe how Mithras's strike released the universe's vital force, with the bull's blood becoming wheat and vine's creation springing from destruction. The initiation rites took this symbolism to chilling extremes. New members, called Korax the Raven, would lie in a trench beneath a wooden bull as priests above slit its throat, drenching them in warm blood. This wasn't mere shock theater. The bloodbath marked a rebirth, washing away the initiate's old self as the bull's sacrifice had once washed the world. Some Mithria have grooves in their floors, suggesting liquids, whether blood, wine, or both, flowed ritualistically toward the participants. What unsettled outsiders wasn't just the violence, but the cult's precision. Mithraic temples were built to align with solstices, their ceilings pierced so sunlight would strike the tauroctony at key dates. Initiates progressed through 7 grades, each tied to a planet, from Mercury's winged Caduceus to Saturn's sickle. And always the bull's death loomed not as an end, but as a cosmic reset button. Modern excavations reveal fragments of the cult's secrets. A fresco in Capua shows initiates blindfolded, their hands bound with chicken entrails. Another in Ostia depicts a meal where worshippers reenacted Mithras and Saul sharing the bull's flesh. But the most telling clue lies in the Mithria themselves, hidden beneath bakeries, barracks, and bathhouses, as if the cult knew their power lay not in grand temples, but in the dark where a knife's flash could rewrite the stars. Silence wasn't just a discipline for Pythagoras's inner circle, it was a sacred barrier between the human and the divine. New initiates into his mystery school faced a rule that would unsettle even the most devoted modern seekers, a mandated 5-year vow of silence where speech was considered a contaminant to the soul's purity. Imagine spending half a decade without uttering a single word, where every thought had to be refined internally before earning the right to be spoken aloud. This wasn't about secrecy, it was about spiritual alchemy. The Pythagoreans believed sound wasn't merely vibration, it was a cosmic force. Just as musical harmonies governed the movements of planets, human speech could disrupt or elevate the soul's resonance. Initiates who broke the silence weren't just scolded, they faced expulsion, their belongings ceremonially burned in a mock funeral. Ancient accounts describe outcasts being buried under tombstones inscribed with their names, as if their betrayal of silence had killed their place in the community. But the practice's true genius lay in its psychological depth. During those silent years, students weren't idle. They observed, listened to lectures without responding, and trained in the cult's secret sign language, a system of taps, gestures, and geometric symbols used to communicate without polluting the air with speech. Only after mastering this language of shapes could they advance to the next tier, where whispered discussions about sacred mathematics were permitted. The most striking testimony comes from a fragment by Aristotle, who noted that Pythagoreans considered unworthy words a stain on the soul's garment. One anecdote tells of a disciple who, after years of silence, finally spoke only to be expelled because his first sentence contained a grammatical error, proving his mind wasn't yet purified. Another story describes initiates forced to stand all night with arms outstretched if they coughed or laughed during rituals, their bodies punished for involuntary breaches of quiet. Yet this austerity wasn't cruelty, it was a forge. By stripping away speech, Pythagoras forced his followers to confront the noise within. Silence revealed arrogance in unfinished thoughts, laziness in unexamined opinions. Those who endured emerged with a terrifying clarity. When they finally earned the right to speak, their words carried weight enough to shape Greek philosophy for centuries. Archaeologists have found strange tokens in Croton, where Pythagoras' school thrived, small lead tablets pierced with holes, possibly silence tallies, used to count a student's mute years. But the most haunting relic isn't physical. It's the legend that Pythagoras himself could hear the music of the cosmos, a harmony only audible when human clamor ceased. His followers didn't just take a vow, they stepped into that silence, straining to hear the universe whisper back. The worshipper stood rigid as the priest uncoiled the serpent from its bronze vessel, its scales catching the torchlight like molten gold. This was no ordinary temple, this was the domain of Sabazius, the Thracian god whose mysteries slithered between life and death. As the snake's cool body brushed against bare skin, initiates didn't flinch. They welcomed it, believing each ripple of muscle carried the god's own voice whispering secrets of resurrection. Sabazius wasn't just a deity of the underworld. He was a shapeshifter, often depicted with a serpent entwined around his staff, a living bridge between worlds. His cult's most sacred rite involved releasing non-venomous snakes onto initiates' bodies during ecstatic dances, their movements mirroring the serpent's sinuous grace. Ancient texts describe how the snakes would coil around arms, slide across eyelids, even enter mouths as participants lay in trance states. To outsiders, it looked like madness. To the faithful, it was the ultimate surrender, allowing the symbol of rebirth to traverse their flesh as freely as a soul crossing between realms. The ritual's power lay in its duality. Snakes were both feared and revered in antiquity, their ability to shed skin making them walking metaphors for transformation. By inviting physical contact, initiates enacted a paradox, confronting terror to unlock transcendence. A 4th century fresco from Thrace shows a woman in ritual garb with serpents draped over her shoulders like living jewelry, her face serene amidst the coiling chaos. What modern observers might see as a stunt was for her an act of sacred mimicry, becoming like Sabazius himself, who was said to shed his mortality as easily as a snake sheds its skin. But the practice wasn't just symbolic theater. The cult's hymns, preserved on fragmented lead tablets, speak of the serpent's touch as a cold flame that scorched away impurities. Initiates fasted for days beforehand, drinking potions of mint and wine to sharpen their senses. When the snakes finally glided over their skin, the sensation wasn't meant to repel, it was a baptism. The most devoted even wore snake-shaped rings, their bands carved to mimic scales, so they might carry the god's presence long after the rite ended. Archaeologists have unearthed eerie proof of the ritual's rich terracotta vessels with serpentine handles from Athens to the Black Sea, all depicting Sabazius's signature motif. Most chilling are the reports from Roman authorities, who later adopted the cult but sanitized its practices. A first-century magistrate's letter complains of Bacchic fools letting asps crawl upon their nakedness, revealing how the rite unsettled even the empire's jaded elite. Yet for those who surrendered to the serpent's embrace, the reward was worth the risk, a glimpse behind the veil where death wasn't an end, but a skin to be shed when the god called. What modern minds might dismiss as primitive superstition held razor-sharp psychological insight. The act of enduring the snake's touch, an instinctive fear for most, forged a new neural pathway, terror transformed into ecstasy. Just as soldiers today undergo exposure therapy to master their fears, Sabazius's initiates learned to rewrite their deepest instincts. When the last scale slid from their fingertips, they weren't just reborn. They were unshackled. The altar stone was slick with it, dark, glistening rivulets creeping across the marble like living tendrils. As the priest lifted the sacrificial ram's severed head, its tongue lolling between slack jaws, the initiates leaned forward not in horror but hunger. This was the moment the cult of Zagreus waited for, the chance to lap at the steaming blood as it dripped from the carcass, swallowing the essence of the butchered god himself. Zagreus wasn't worshipped like other deities. In Orphic myth, he was Dionysus's precursor, a divine child torn apart by titans, his flesh devoured save for the heart still pulsating in the dirt. The blood-drinking ritual recreated this primal violation in reverse. By consuming the sacrificial animal's blood, initiates didn't just honor Zagreus, they became him, absorbing the god's shattered power into their own veins. Ancient hymns describe the act as eating the god's pain, transforming trauma into transcendence. What makes this practice especially chilling is its eerie foreshadowing of vampire myths. Greek travelers to Thrace wrote of Zagreus devotees with teeth filed to points, their mouths stained rust-red from frequent rites. One account claims they'd smear blood on their faces before battle, believing it made them impervious to swords. A dark parallel to later Balkan legends of warriors returning from the dead craving blood. Even the god's epithets, night roamer, raw eater, sound less like titles and more like warnings, but there was method to the macabre. The blood wasn't taken randomly. Specific animals mirrored Zagreus's mythic dismemberment, rams for his horns, bulls for his strength, even deer whose spooked eyes reflected his panic. The blood had to be consumed warm before the spirit escaped, and always mixed with wine, a symbolic dilution of mortality with divinity. Some temple reliefs show initiates catching the blood in file bowls shaped like leaves, an allusion to the nymphs who supposedly gathered Zagreus's scattered remains. Modern excavations have turned up shrines with altars grooved like butcher blocks, their channels converging into cups where blood pooled for ritual use. But the most telling evidence comes from curse tablets found in Corinth, where devotees threatened enemies with Zagreus's thirst, promising the god would drink their veins dry. This wasn't metaphor, it was a belief that blood held the currency of life and that by swallowing it you traded death for divinity. The cult's most unsettling legacy, though, lies in its psychological precision. The act of drinking blood, an almost universal taboo, created a visceral boundary between initiates and the outside world. After tasting what society deemed unholy, followers couldn't unknow the metallic tang of transcendence. It's no coincidence that early Christian writers condemned these rites as devil's communion, seeing in them a warped mirror of their own sacrament. Both promised immortality through flesh and blood. Only the Zagreus cult dared to take it literally. The ground shook as bronze-clad figures circled the fire, their faces hidden behind grotesque masks of hammered metal. These weren't warriors preparing for battle, they were the Corybantes, Cybele's most enigmatic priests whose dances didn't just honor the goddess, they rewired the mind itself. Imagine the scene, drumbeats like thunder, the clang of swords against shields, and beneath it all, the high, keening wail of flutes. To witness this ritual was to stand at the intersection of madness and miracle, where the cure for a fractured psyche lay in surrendering to the chaos. The Corybantes didn't merely perform, they invaded. Ancient texts describe how they descend upon initiates suffering from heroic melancholy, what we might call depression or PTSD, their masked faces eliminating all human expression, leaving only the raw presence of the divine. The afflicted would be pulled into the whirlwind of movement, forced to match the erratic rhythms until their own thoughts dissolved into the cacophony. Plato himself wrote of these rites in Euthydemus, noting how the dissonance shook loose the black bile from troubled minds. Modern scholars recognize the unsettling genius behind the method. The masks weren't just theatrical, they were psychological weapons. By stripping away individuality, they created a blank slate where the goddess's power could imprint. The drums, tuned to specific frequencies, induced altered states, while the dissonant flute music recreated from ancient fragments mimicked the brain's own distress signals. Initiates didn't just hear the ritual, they felt it in their jawbones, their ribcage, the pit of their stomachs, but the true shock came in the aftermath. Those who endured the ordeal reported visions of Cybele riding a lion through their minds, her presence burning away obsessive thoughts like chaff. One account from Pergamon tells of a soldier who hadn't slept in months, haunted by battlefield ghosts. After 3 nights immersed in the Corybantic frenzy, he collapsed and awoke believing the goddess had eaten his nightmares. Archaeologists have unearthed relics that whisper of these practices. Bronze masks with hinged jaws that clattered shut during dances, tiny bells sewn into priests' armor to amplify the sensory overload. Most telling are the votive offerings, crude clay figurines of humans with spirals for eyes, their bodies curled as if still caught in the dance. These weren't mere trinkets. They were maps of a radical idea, that sometimes to heal a broken mind you must first shatter it completely. The air smelled of damp earth and crushed herbs as the sick pilgrim limped into the dimly lit abaton, the sacred dormitory where miracles weren't just hoped for, they were expected. This wasn't a hospital in the modern sense, it was a threshold between worlds where the god Asclepius himself would walk among the sleeping, his serpent coiled around his staff like a living scalpel. For centuries, thousands flocked to temples like Epidaurus, surrendering to a ritual that blurred medicine and mysticism, the enkoimesis or sacred sleep, where healing came not from potions but from dreams. The process was deceptively simple. After days of purification, bathing in holy springs, fasting on barley water, and offering clay models of their afflicted body parts, patients would lie on the temple's dreaming couch, a stone slab covered with the skins of sacrificial rams. As they drifted into twilight, priests released non-venomous snakes into the chamber, their flickering tongues said to carry the god's own healing power. Ancient inscriptions detail how these serpents would slither over eyelids, trace the outlines of tumors, even enter open wounds, a sensation initiates described not as repulsive but as cool fire. But the true magic happened in the liminal space between sleep and waking. Patients reported visions of Asclepius appearing as a bearded physician, his hands glowing as he performed surgeries that left no scars. One account from Epidaurus tells of a man with a festering leg wound who dreamed the god serpent, licked it clean only to wake with fresh pink skin. Another describes a blind woman whose vision returned when the god placed 2 fingers over her eyes and the night became day. What modern scholars find most fascinating isn't just the cures but the staging. The abaton was strategically designed to amplify the experience. Floors were heated to mimic the body's fever, herbs like opium poppy smoked to induce trance states, and underground channels created eerie echoes of hissing, making the snake's movements sound like whispers from the god himself. The temple's famed acoustics could project a priest's voice to sound as if it emanated from the statue of Asclepius, reinforcing the illusion of divine presence. Archaeologists have unearthed thousands of votive offerings at these sites: terracotta limbs, eyes, and even wombs inscribed with gratitude. But the most revealing finds are the iamata, stone tablets documenting successful healings. One records a man who laughed when told Asclepius could regrow hair, until he dreamed of the god rubbing ointment on his bald scalp and awoke with a full head of curls. Another tells of a woman pregnant for 5 years finally giving birth after the god cut open her womb in a dream. The cult's brilliance lay in its synthesis of psychology and theater. The same temples that housed dream incubations also featured daily dramas where priests reenacted the god's mythic healings, priming visitors' expectations. The sacred snakes, always a specific golden breed, were trained to be docile, their touch transforming fear into reverence. Even the timing was calculated. Most incubations occurred before major festivals, when the air buzzed with collective anticipation. Yet for all its spectacle, the ritual's power was deeply personal. Unlike other mystery cults that promised abstract transcendence, Asclepius offered tangible relief. A 1st-century inscription from Rome captures this intimacy. To Asclepius, the baker Eudemus gives thanks. For 10 years I suffered until the god came to me as I slept, holding a pomegranate. When I ate it, the pain left as if drawn out by his hands. The pomegranate, symbol of life and death, wasn't just fruit here. It was a key to the body's own capacity to heal when the mind truly believed. Modern medicine might dismiss these cures as placebo, but the temple's legacy endures in surprising ways. The rod of Asclepius, a single serpent entwined around a staff, remains the symbol of healing worldwide, while the concept of hospital sleep studies echoes ancient incubation. Perhaps the greatest lesson lies in the cult's understanding that illness isn't just physical. It's a story we tell ourselves, one the god of medicine rewrote night after night in the language of dreams. The initiate extended his right hand, fingers curled in a precise pattern, not to grasp but to speak without words. In the torchlit depths of Mithraic temples, handshakes weren't mere greetings. They were living ciphers, a silent language that could mean the difference between being welcomed as a brother or exposed as an impostor. Each grip, each subtle pressure of fingertips against palm conveyed rank, allegiance, and even sacred knowledge passed down through generations. These gestures operated on multiple layers of meaning. The most basic was the dexiosis, a handshake where the thumb pressed against the initiate's wrist rather than the palm. To outsiders, it looked like an ordinary clasp, but the placement of that thumb mirrored Mithras' own grip as he hauled the cosmic bull to sacrifice, a nod to the cult's central myth. More advanced variants involved interlacing fingers in patterns representing zodiac signs, or pressing a hidden knuckle against the other's pulse point to test familiarity with secret hymns. Archaeologists have found clues etched into temple walls, faded reliefs showing figures shaking hands with deliberate anomalies. One in Ostia Antiquar depicts 2 men grasping forearms instead of hands, their thumbs forming a hidden triangle symbolizing the 3 grades of initiation. Another in London shows an initiate placing his pinky finger over his companion's wrist, a gesture later adopted by medieval guilds. The system's brilliance lay in its adaptability. Regional variations flourished. Some temples used a double handshake where initiates briefly switched to left hands, echoing Mithras' duality as both solar deity and underworld conqueror. Others incorporated objects. Passing a small bull figurine during the handshake signaled mastery of the highest rites. Roman military recruits, who formed the cult's core membership, adapted military grips into sacred codes. A cavalryman might twist his wrist slightly mid-shake, a reference to Mithras' horseback birth. What unsettled Roman authorities wasn't the secrecy itself, but its effectiveness. A 2nd-century edict complained of soldiers knowing one another by fingerwork, bypassing chain of command. The grip system enabled Mithraists to organize across vast distances. A merchant in Syria could confirm a stranger's allegiance in Gaul without uttering a word. Modern parallels appear in unexpected places. The Masonic, lion's paw, grip, and even contemporary fraternity handshakes owe traces to these ancient practices. But Mithraism's version held darker stakes. Broken fingers were reportedly the punishment for misusing the sacred grips, and one inscription warns of a curse falling upon those who clasp without the god's leave. In a world where divine favor meant survival, these weren't just passwords. They were lifelines woven into the very bones of the hand. The darkness inside the telesterion was absolute. No torches, no moon, just a suffocating blackness pressing against the initiate's skin as they huddled together in the sacred hall. Then, without warning, a single voice shattered the silence. Brimo. The cry wasn't just spoken. It was ripped from the throat, raw and guttural, echoing off the stone walls like a challenge thrown at the cosmos itself. In that pulse of sound, centuries of fear and wonder collided. This was the climactic moment of the Eleusinian mysteries, where shouting the name of the chthonic goddess Brimo wasn't just devotion, it was a ritualized duel with mortality. Brimo wasn't a comforting deity. Her name meant the Angry One, a title linking her to Persephone's most terrifying aspect, the queen who'd stared into the abyss of Hades and emerged transformed. To scream her name wasn't invocation, it was confrontation. Ancient accounts describe how initiates prepared for months, fasting and meditating on their own deaths, so when the moment came, their voices carried the weight of everything they feared losing. The genius of the ritual lay in its physicality. The shout wasn't scripted or synchronized, it erupted spontaneously from someone in the crowd, triggering a chain reaction as others joined, their collective voices building into a primal roar. Modern scholars debate the scream's purpose. Some argue it mimicked Persephone's cry when Hades dragged her underground, a sonic reenactment of the myth. Others believe it served as psychological shock therapy, forcing participants to vocalize their deepest terrors to rob them of power. A fragment from a lost hymn found in Macedonia suggests the cry was also a test. Only those whose voices do not crack shall pass beyond the veil. The implication, true enlightenment, required facing annihilation without flinching. What makes this practice eerily profound is its staging. The telesterion's acoustics were meticulously designed to amplify the scream's disorienting effects. Sound waves would bounce off the polished stone, making it seem as if Brimo herself howled back from all directions. Initiates often describe the experience as hearing their own voices twist into something not human, as though the goddess had momentarily possessed them. This wasn't theater, it was alchemy transforming terror into ecstasy through sheer sonic force. The aftermath was just as calculated. Following the scream, priests would suddenly illuminate the hall with a blaze of torches, revealing a golden statue of Persephone holding sheaves of wheat, a visual promise that from the confrontation with death came rebirth. Those who'd shouted reported feeling emptied and remade, as if the scream had torn something diseased from their souls. Archaeologists have found tiny lead tablets near Eleusis inscribed with just one word, Brimo. These weren't prayers, they were relics of that pivotal moment when mortal throats became conduits for the divine. To modern ears, it might sound like superstition. But neuroscience offers a startling parallel. Studies show that screaming activates the amygdala, flooding the body with cathartic release. The ancients may not have known brain chemistry, but they understood one immutable truth: sometimes, to conquer darkness, you must first give it a name, then hurl that name into the void with everything you have. Under the cold glow of a moon veiled by clouds, the figure in black moved silently toward the crossroads, dragging something heavy behind her, a struggling black dog, its muzzle bound with scarlet cords. This was no ordinary sacrifice. The ritual about to unfold belonged to Hecate, goddess of witchcraft and the restless dead, whose midnight rites transformed ordinary intersections into gateways to the underworld. To sacrifice a dog here wasn't just an offering. It was an invitation for the goddess's own spectral hounds to cross over, their ghostly forms said to materialize from the shadows to serve or savage those who dared summon them. The choice of victim held layers of meaning. Black dogs weren't random. Their coats mirrored the darkness Hecate ruled, their loyalty echoing her role as guardian of thresholds. Ancient curse tablets found near Athenian crossroads describe the ritual in chilling detail. After strangling the dog, never with a blade, for spilled blood would anger the goddess, the body was split into 3 parts, each hung from a different road sign. The act mirrored Hecate's triple form, while the division created a spiritual tripwire that alerted her ghostly pack. A 4th century lead amulet from Thessaly warns, "Beware the crossroads where no birds sing." There her dogs hunger, but the ritual's true power lay in its duality. For some, these sacrifices were acts of desperate protection. Farmers left dog hearts pierced with iron nails at country crossroads to ward off plagues, believing Hecate's hounds would devour the illness before it reached their fields. Others used the rite to curse. A fragmentary play by Sophocles mentions a jilted lover leaving a dog's corpse with her rival's name carved into its tongue, trusting the goddess's pack to hunt the name's owner through dreams. Archaeology confirms how widespread and feared the practice was. Excavations at Sicilian crossroads have uncovered canine skeletons with their skulls deliberately crushed, some still wearing bronze collars inscribed Hecate's, Hecate's property. Most haunting are the whisper jars, ceramic vessels buried near, by containing dog teeth and folded lead strips. Unrolled, these reveal pleas like, "Send your bitches to tear at my enemy's lungs," or "Let your pack howl between me and death." What unsettled contemporary observers wasn't just the brutality, but the ritual's lingering effects. Theologist Porphyry wrote of travelers hearing phantom barks for years after witnessing a sacrifice, while Plutarch claimed the ghosts of the sacrificed dogs could be seen prowling during lunar eclipses. The cult's genius was in its psychological theater. By turning every crossroads into a potential haunt, they ensured devotees never walked alone. Even today, echoes persist in folklore. The black dogs of British legend, the Cadillo spirits of Latin America, all descendants of Hecate's midnight pack, still padding through the edges of our collective nightmares. The basin wasn't filled with water, but with a swirling mixture so thick it clung to the skin like liquid silk, part wine, part milk, and all intoxication. For followers of Bacchus, this wasn't just a bath. It was an alchemical marriage of opposites, the ferment of grapes meeting the purity of breast milk, creating a potent cocktail for spiritual rebirth. Imagine sinking into that frothing pool, the scent of fermented fruit and warm dairy wrapping around you as temple drums pounded in time with your own heartbeat. This was purification turned inside out, not the scrubbing away of dirt, but the saturation of the senses until the very boundaries of self dissolved. The ritual's power lay in its deliberate imbalance. Wine represented ecstasy, chaos, the tearing down of rational thought. Milk symbolized nourishment, innocence, the primal bond between mother and child. By merging them, initiates enacted a paradox, reverting to infantile vulnerability while simultaneously ascending to divine frenzy. Ancient frescoes from Pompeii show women waist-deep in these mixtures, their heads thrown back as vines seem to grow from their very pores. One account from a Roman senator sneers at how bathers emerged stinking like a drunkard's cradle, but the insult reveals the rite's genius. They weren't just cleansed. They were remade, their bodies temporarily transformed into vessels where opposites coexisted. What happened next depended on the dosage. Mild baths, wine diluted with fresh goat's milk, induced trance states where devotees claimed to hear Bacchus whispering through the vineyard winds. But the most extreme mixtures, heavy with undiluted wine and curdled milk, became portals to ritual madness. Plutarch describes initiates thrashing in the pools, their skin flushed scarlet as if the god's own blood had entered them. Some tore at their hair, crying out prophecies in languages they'd never learned. others collapsed into the liquid, only to rise moments later with eyes black as midnight, speaking with the voice of the god himself. Archaeologists have found traces of these baths in unexpected places, shallow stone basins near vineyards with residue testing positive for both dairy proteins and tartaric acid. But the most revealing evidence comes from tiny curse tablets buried nearby, where bathers begged Bacchus to pour himself into their veins or cursed rivals to drown in sour milk. The threats weren't metaphorical. To these devotees, the bath wasn't just a ritual, it was a transfusion of divinity, one that could uplift or destroy depending on the god's whims. Modern science offers a startling lens to view this practice. Wine's alcohol opened capillaries, accelerating absorption of milk's tryptophan, a compound linked to trance states. The warm liquid also induced mild sensory deprivation, amplifying suggestibility, but the ancients needed no biochemistry to understand the bath's power. They knew truth in their bones. Sometimes to reach the divine, you must first marinate in its contradictions until the wine stains your soul and the milk coats your throat with the taste of something older than reason. The flesh tore easily under their teeth, still warm from the animal's final heartbeat. This was no ordinary meal, it was the omophagia, the Dionysian sacrament where consuming raw flesh became an act of divine possession. Imagine the scene. Initiates, their faces smeared with blood and vine leaves, swallowing chunks of undressed meat as flutes shrieked and torches spat embers into the night sky. To modern senses, it's grotesque, but for the Maenads and their male counterparts, the Bacchantes, this was the moment the god's spirit flooded their veins like unmixed wine. The ritual followed a brutal logic. After days of dancing to exhaustion and drinking wine laced with hallucinogens, participants would seize a live bull, goat, or deer animals sacred to Dionysus and tear them apart with bare hands. No knives were allowed. This was violence stripped to its primal essence. Ancient vase paintings capture the frenzy. Women with wild eyes gripping slick, crimson-streaked haunches, their mouths open not in disgust but rapture. The key wasn't just eating flesh, it was consuming it raw, as Dionysus had been devoured by the Titans in myth. Heat from cooking symbolized civilization's order. The omophagia rejected that entirely, returning to a state before fire, before rules, before the separation of human and beast. But whispers persisted of rites that crossed an even darker threshold. Fragmentary accounts speak of stranger feasts where the sacrificed animal was replaced by a human, sometimes a willing initiate, sometimes a captive outsider. The 5th century historian Hellanicus describes mountainside rituals where participants mistook men for stags in their madness, tearing at friends and foes alike. A shattered inscription from Thrace warns of those who taste the two-legged meat, claiming they gain Dionysus's power but lose their humanity in the process. Modern scholars debate whether these were literal acts or metaphorical nightmares spun by the cult's enemies. Yet archaeology offers chilling clues. A cave near Mount Parnassus held human bones mixed with animal remains, all bearing teeth marks matching the ritual knives used to scrape flesh from bone. The omophagia's psychological grip lay in its terrifying intimacy. Unlike passive animal sacrifices at Olympian temples, this demanded participants become the butcher, the eater, and eventually, in their hallucinogen-fueled visions, the eaten. Plutarch recounts how initiates would later describe feeling their own flesh torn by invisible jaws during the ritual, as if Dionysus himself was consuming them from within. This wasn't just communion, it was annihilation and rebirth chewed into existence, one bloody mouthful at a time. What unsettled contemporary observers wasn't merely the violence but the ecstasy that accompanied it. Writers like Euripides emphasized the bliss on Maenads' faces as they feasted, a stark contrast to the horror of their acts. The secret may lie in the neurochemistry of extreme states, endorphins from exhaustion, dopamine from the triumph of the hunt, and hallucinogens blurring the line between self and God. A 1st-century physician's notes found in Anatolia described treating a bacchant who, after the omophagia, couldn't feel pain for 3 days, her fingers broken without protest, her skin unflinching at a hot iron's touch. The cult's most enduring legacy, though, is its twisted mirror held up to civilization's fragility. In a society that prized cooked meat as a hallmark of humanity, the omophagia screamed a dangerous truth. Beneath the veneer of togas and treaties, we're all just creatures of blood and hunger. Dionysus's followers didn't just worship that truth, they swallowed it whole. At dawn, the women climbed to the rooftops carrying clay pots filled not with flowers but with soil and seeds, wheat, fennel, lettuce plants chosen because they sprang up fast and died even faster. These were the gardens of Adonis, ephemeral creations that bloomed and withered in just 8 days, mirroring the brief, tragic life of the beautiful youth torn apart by a wild boar. But the ritual wasn't just about mourning. It was a living metaphor where the act of planting became a funeral, and the sprout's rapid death a celebration of nature's cruel, exquisite cycle. The symbolism ran deeper than the shallow soil. Adonis, lover of Aphrodite, spent half the year with her in the sunlit world and half with Persephone in the underworld, a myth explaining the changing seasons. His gardens distilled this duality into a microcosm. Women tended the plants with exaggerated care, watering them with tears, shading them from harsh sunlight, only to deliberately neglect them as the festival reached its climax. Ancient poets describe how the tender green shoots would yellow almost visibly, their collapse mourned with wailing and torn garments. Then, in a shockingly casual finale, the shriveled plants were tossed into rivers or the sea, their tiny corpses carried away like Adonis's own shattered body. What makes this ritual fascinating is its inversion of normal agricultural logic. Unlike farmers who prayed for sturdy, enduring crops, the Adonia celebrated fragility. The lettuce, a plant Greeks associated with impotence and quick decay, was particularly symbolic. One account from Alexandria describes women giggling as they planted it, joking about seed that rises too fast and falls just as quickly, a not-so-subtle nod to Adonis's legendary beauty and equally famous recklessness. The wheat, though, held darker meaning. Sprouted in summer's heat when no sane farmer would plant, it was doomed from the start, a deliberate defiance of nature's order that mirrored Adonis's own doomed defiance of mortality. Archaeologists have found traces of these rooftop gardens across the Mediterranean, shards of perforated pots designed to drain too quickly, terraces with soil too shallow for proper roots. But the most revealing evidence comes from unexpected sources. Greek comedy plays mocking the festival's emotional excesses. In Aristophanes' Lysistrata, women joke about using their Adonis tears to avoid marital duties, while a fragment from Menander describes a prostitute pretending to mourn the gardens as cover for a secret tryst. This satire proves how widespread the ritual was and how subversive. By turning rooftops into temporary underworlds, women claimed public space for private grief, upending gender norms under the guise of piety. The festival's climax, when the withered plants were thrown into water, wasn't mere disposal. It reenacted Aphrodite's desperate attempt to preserve Adonis's beauty by transforming his blood into anemones. Some versions of the myth claim the rivers turned red where the plants were dumped, a phenomenon modern scholars suggest might stem from red clay or algae stirred up by the ritual. But to participants, the color was magic, proof that death wasn't an end, but a translation into something else. A 1st-century fresco from Pompeii shows women watching their floating gardens with knowing smiles, suggesting the funeral was really a rehearsal. After all, next year, they'd climb those rooftops and plant again. This cyclical defiance is the ritual's genius. Unlike most Greek rites that sought to control nature, the Adonia embraced futility. By nurturing what couldn't survive, women acknowledged life's fleeting sweetness while thumbing their noses at the very gods who ordained it. The poet Theocritus captures this perfectly. We weep today, but tomorrow we'll plant once more for what's lovelier than a life that dares to bloom knowing it must fall. The sanctuary doors creaked shut behind the last initiate, sealing the chamber in darkness so complete it pressed against the skin like a second robe. At the room's center loomed the silhouette of Isis, her statue draped from crown to pedestal in layer upon layer of linen, black for mourning, blue for the Nile's depths, crimson for the blood she spilled gathering Osiris's scattered limbs. This was no ordinary covering. Each veil represented a stage in her mythic quest, and tonight the initiates would relive her grief and cunning one unveiled fold at a time. The ritual began with a hush so profound the dripping of sacred water from the ceiling seemed deafening. A priestess stepped forward, her hands gloved in gold to avoid direct contact with divinity, and grasped the first veil. The black shroud symbolizing Isis's despair when Seth first murdered and dismembered her husband. As the cloth whispered to the floor, the initiates knelt, pressing their foreheads to cold stone in shared sorrow. Ancient hymns describe how the room's temperature would plummet at this moment, breath visible in torchlight as if the goddess's icy grief had seeped into the very air. With each subsequent unveiling, the drama intensified. The blue veils representing her journey down the Nile were removed to the sound of sistrums shaking their jangling metal discs mimicking river reeds brushing against her boat. When the final crimson veil fell, revealing the gleaming gold face of Isis, priests would produce a cedar box containing 14 fragments of rare stones, lapis for the head, carnelian for the heart, obsidian for the phallus, each corresponding to a body part she'd recovered from the floodplains. Initiates took turns placing them in a wooden Osiris effigy, their fingers trembling not just from reverence but from the eerie sensation that the stones pulsed with warmth as if animated by the goddess's touch. What made these rites revolutionary was their tactile intimacy. Unlike Egyptian state rituals where only pharaohs touched the divine, Isis's mysteries granted commoners the privilege of reassembling Osiris themselves. A 1st-century fresco from Pompeii's Isium shows initiates with tears streaming down their faces as they handle the sacred fragments, their expressions caught between awe and an almost maternal tenderness. The message was clear. Just as Isis pieced her husband back together, she could mend the brokenness in every worshipper's life. Archaeologists have uncovered traces of these ceremonies from London to the Black Sea, tattered veil fragments with golden thread still woven through them, miniature Osiris effigies missing stone inserts. Most poignant are the personal prayers etched onto lead strips found in Corinth. "Lady of the Veils, gather my sorrow as you gathered his bones," pleads one. Another simply states, "I have touched the god and am no longer afraid." The genius of the ritual lay in its emotional choreography. By physically removing each veil, participants didn't just hear Isis's story, they enacted it, their own hands becoming hers. When torchlight finally struck the unveiled statue's face, many reported seeing the gold lips curl into a smile, a phenomenon modern scholars attribute to the play of flickering light on hammered metal. But to those who'd spent hours in the dark peeling away layers of sacred cloth, it wasn't illusion. It was the goddess herself, whispering without words that what is shattered can always be made whole again. Dawn light crept over the Athenian roadside, revealing the damage, dozens of stone herms, their faces chiseled away, their prominent phalluses smashed to rubble. This wasn't mindless vandalism. It was sacred sabotage, a calculated act of defiance tied to the most dangerous mystery cult initiations. These phallic statues of Hermes, guardians of travelers and commerce, were more than landmarks. They were thresholds between worlds, and defacing them became the ultimate test of a candidate's willingness to break society's taboos for the promise of hidden knowledge. The ritual's brilliance lay in its dual betrayal. Herms stood at crossroads, city gates, and private homes, their very presence warding off misfortune. To mutilate one wasn't just property damage, it was an assault on communal safety, a crime punishable by death. Ancient court records describe initiates caught mid-act, their chisels still gripped in shaking hands as they confessed to acting under orders of the unseen ones. What modern eyes might dismiss as juvenile prank held deadly stakes. By striking these sacred symbols, candidates proved they valued esoteric truth over civic duty, severing ties to the everyday world before stepping into the clandestine. But the phallus wasn't targeted randomly. In mystery cults like those of Dionysus and Orpheus, the generative force represented divine creative power. Breaking it enacted a paradox, destroying fertility to access higher rebirth. A 4th century vase painting shows a masked figure hammering a Herm's phallus while whispering into its ear, suggesting the act wasn't mere destruction but a transfer of energy. Initiates believed the statue's power flooded into them through the act of violation, their hands becoming conduits for Hermes' trickster magic. Archaeologists have found Herms with peculiar damage patterns, precise strikes to the groin but untouched faces, or vice versa. Some bear faint inscriptions, "The god laughs at broken things," or "Enter through the wound." Most chilling are the ones discovered near Eleusis, their phalluses carefully removed and placed nearby as if awaiting reattachment. This wasn't chaos, it was ritual surgery, excising the divine from stone to implant it in flesh. The cult's most subversive secret, many initiates were prominent citizens, generals, merchants, even lawmakers. By night, they became vandals in service of powers older than Athens itself. A speech by Lysias mentions an honored general seen fleeing a mutilated Herm, his senator's cloak splattered with stone dust. When questioned, he supposedly smiled and said, "Hermes knows what he owes me." The message was clear: loyalty to the mysteries trumped even the state's most sacred symbols. Modern reconstructions show the psychological genius behind these rites. The adrenaline of committing sacrilege, the terror of capture, the euphoria of getting away with it, all forged unbreakable bonds between initiates. Like soldiers sharing the trauma of battle, they became kin through shared transgression. A fragmentary hymn found in Thessaly puts it plainly: "What breaks the stone breaks the soul's cage too." The shattered Herms weren't just tests, they were mirrors, reflecting the initiate's own fractured humanity before the mysteries pieced them back together, stronger, stranger, and sworn to silence. The dancer's spine straightened as the priestess placed the sacred kernels upon her head, a clay vessel brimming with seeds, herbs, and a single drop of honeycomb wax. One sudden movement, one stumble, and the entire offering would spill to the ground, shattering months of preparation. Yet the initiate didn't flinch. Eyes fixed ahead, she began the slow, swaying steps of the Thesmophoria, her bare feet pressing into the temple's earthen floor in time with unseen drums. This wasn't mere choreography. It was a high-stakes meditation where balance meant more than physical grace. It symbolized the precarious dance between life and death, between the spilled blood of Persephone's descent and the sweet promise of her return. The Kernos itself was a microcosm of the Eleusinian mysteries. Its compartments held barley from last year's harvest, poppy pods for the sleep of winter, and fresh mint to cleanse the tongue before uttering sacred words. But the honey was the key, a golden drop representing the moment when Demeter, in her grief, finally accepted a sip of nourishment from the nymph Bobo, breaking her fast and allowing the world to green again. To carry this vessel wasn't just an act of devotion, it was a reenactment of the goddess's own journey from despair to hope. Ancient texts describe how initiates trained for months to master the dance's peculiar rhythm, neither too slow to seem lifeless nor too quick to risk spillage. The movements mirrored Demeter's restless wandering during her daughter's absence. 3 steps forward, a pause, 2 steps back, then a sudden turn, like the moment she tore her veil upon hearing Persephone's voice from the underworld. The faint slosh of seeds inside the kernels served as a metronome, punishing any lapse in concentration. A fresco from Pompey's Villa of the Mysteries shows a woman mid-step, her face a study in focus, while another kneels weeping beside her overturned vessel, its contents strewn like a failed harvest. What modern scholars find remarkable is the ritual's layered psychology. The weight of the kernos, roughly equal to a human head, was no accident. Initiates reported feeling as though they carried their own skulls, an eerie sensation compounded by the flickering torchlight that turned dancing shadows into towering specters. Some accounts describe participants entering a trance where the vessel seemed to whisper, its contents alive with the rustle of growing things. A recovered hymn fragment speaks of the kernos breathing, suggesting the boundary between object and bearer blurred under the rite's transformative pressure. The climax came when dancers formed a spiraling labyrinth, their kernoi tilting perilously as they pivoted to face the center where a priestess held the holy basket of Kykeon. Those who completed the circuit without spilling a single grain were deemed twice born, their steadiness proving they could navigate life's chaos without losing the essence of their souls. Museum collections hold kernoi with peculiar wear patterns, deep grooves where generations of initiates grip them too tightly, smooth patches from anxious thumbs rubbing the same spot for luck. But the most revealing artifacts are the broken one's shattered vessels found buried at crossroads with their contents intact. These weren't discarded failures. They were offerings left where two paths met, as a reminder that even in collapse there's sacred potential. A 1st century inscription from Eleusis puts it plainly. The kernos teaches that what we carry is fragile, but the dance goes on. For modern seekers, the lesson resonates beyond antiquity's torchlit halls. Enlightenment isn't about never stumbling, but learning how to gather what spills and keep moving. The river carried more than water that day. It carried a head, its lips still moving, singing prophecies in a voice that chilled even the gods themselves. Orpheus, the legendary musician torn apart by Maenads for spurning Dionysus, should have been silenced forever. But his decapitated head refused death's quiet, bobbing along the Hebrus River's currents, still chanting verses that made the banks shudder. Fishermen who pulled it from the water swore the eyes tracked them, the tongue forming words no living throat could replicate. This wasn't mere myth to the Orphic cult, it was the foundation of their most sacred relic, a disembodied oracle that whispered truths from beyond the veil. Preserving the head became the cult's obsession. Ancient texts describe a golden reliquary shaped like a lyre, its strings positioned to vibrate when the head spoke, transforming prophecies into eerie music. Initiates would kneel before it, their ears anointed with beeswax and honey, not to block sound but to attune their hearing to the music of the dead. One account from a Thessalian tablet claims the head's predictions came in palindromes, poetic verses that sounded the same forwards and backwards, symbolizing the cyclic nature of life and death. But the ritual's most unsettling detail was its timing. The head only spoke during the hour of no shadow, high noon, when the sun erased all darkness. At this liminal moment, priests would place it on a silver platter etched with labyrinth patterns, believing the maze trapped malevolent spirits that might distort the prophecies. A 1st century historian's note found in Thrace recounts how the skull's jaw would unhinge unnaturally wide, releasing a scent of buried lilies before delivering its riddles. Modern excavations on Lesbos uncovered a shrine with a niche too small for a full statue, its walls scorched black from countless oil lamps. The floor was paved with river-smoothed pebbles, suggesting a ceremonial recreation of the Hebrus's banks. Most chilling, a child's clay doll found nearby, its head carefully removed and placed on a miniature lyre, proof that even the youngest initiates learned to venerate the singing dead. The cult's brilliance lay in embracing this grotesque relic. Unlike orderly Apollonian oracles, Orpheus's head represented knowledge wrested from chaos, its prophecies fragmented like his own scattered limbs. A late Roman poet quipped that consulting it was asking the storm for directions, yet empires paid in gold for its counsel, perhaps because it spoke a truth all rulers fear, that not even death can silence those who know the music of the universe. And the river still murmurs their names long after the blood has washed away. The fruit split open in her hand, juice dark as heart blood pooling in her palm, each seed glistening like a tiny stolen soul. Persephone's pomegranate wasn't just a snack, it was a divine contract, the 6 seeds she ate in the underworld, binding her to Hades for 6 months each year. But in certain mystery cults, this myth became a dire warning. Consuming pomegranate seeds wasn't just a story. It was an act of spiritual bondage, a one-way ticket to the land of the dead with no return. The logic was chillingly precise. Ancient Orphic hymns describe the pomegranate as Hades' lure, its sweetness masking its true nature as a chain. Each seed represented a month of servitude, and initiates were taught that eating even one could tether part of their soul to the underworld prematurely. A 4th century funerary tablet from Thessaly warns, "The dead who taste the red fruit will wander hungry forever, their mouths filled with ash instead of ambrosia." This taboo wasn't about nutrition, it was about cosmic consequences. Rituals drove the lesson home with visceral force. In Lockery, young initiates undergoing Persephone's rites were given pomegranates only to have them dashed from their hands at the last moment. The splattered fruit served as a graphic reminder of what not to consume, both literally and metaphorically. A votive plaque shows a girl recoiling as her pomegranate bursts open at her feet, her face a mix of horror and relief. But the prohibition had a loophole, one that revealed the cult's psychological genius. While fresh seeds were forbidden, fermented pomegranate wine became a sacrament in Dionysian rites. The difference lay in transformation. Just as Persephone's ordeal changed her from maiden to queen, the alchemy of fermentation turned potential poison into elixir. Priests would pour libations from glass vessels shaped like pomegranates, the liquid inside representing not captivity, but the blood of rebirth. Archaeologists have found pits of discarded pomegranates near Eleusinian sanctuaries, all intentionally smashed, some still bearing tooth marks where initiates bit then spat them out in ritual rejection. But the most haunting evidence comes from personal amulets, tiny gold pomegranates worn around the neck with seeds deliberately omitted, a wearable vow to resist the underworld's temptations. The taboo's power lay in its duality. By refusing the seeds, worshippers didn't just avoid fate, they mastered it. A 1st century poet wrote of initiates boasting they could hold Hades' bargain in their palms and laugh, letting the fruit rot untouched as Persephone's story played out on their terms. In a world where death was the ultimate uncertainty, controlling one small piece of it, even symbolically, became the closest thing to immortality. The axe bit deep into the pine's trunk, each strike sending tremors up the arms of the frenzied gallows priests. This was no ordinary logging, it was the Dendrophoria, the most public yet enigmatic ritual of Cybele's cult, where a towering pine became the living embodiment of Attis's tragic myth. Imagine the scene, bloodied hands gripping ropes as dozens of robed figures hauled the tree through crowded streets, its branches scraping against marble temples, its trunk leaving a trail of sap like golden tears on the cobblestones. To bystanders, it might have looked like madness, but for Cybele's initiates, this violent parade was sacred theater, a reenactment of the moment their beloved Attis, driven mad with devotion, castrated himself beneath a pine and bled out onto its roots. The ritual's power lay in its brutal symbolism. The pine wasn't chosen at random, its evergreen needles represented Attis's eternal spirit, while its resin mirrored the divine blood that fertilized the earth. As the galley dragged it toward Cybele's temple, they wailed a haunting hymn describing how the tree's shadow cut deeper than any blade, a reference to both Attis's wound and the initiate's own ritual emasculation. Ancient texts mention how onlookers would sometimes join the procession, pressing coins or locks of hair into the bark as offerings, transforming the pine into a moving altar. But the true shock came at the temple steps. There, the tree was stripped of its branches, wrapped in linen like a corpse, and adorned with violets, flowers said to have sprung from Attis's spilled blood. A 1st-century account from Rome describes how priests then lashed it to Cybele's cult statue, creating a grotesque embrace between goddess and dead consort. For 3 days, the bound tree stood as the center of mourning rites, with initiates gasping their chests and sprinkling their own blood on its trunk. Then, on the final night, it was burned in a pyre so immense its flames could be seen across the city. Archaeologists have found puzzling evidence of these rituals: pine pollen in unlikely urban spaces, votive knives with curved blades perfect for stripping bark. Most revealing are the Dendrophoros inscriptions from Ostia, listing wealthy citizens who sponsored the ritual pine's transport, their names followed by sums that suggest competitive bidding for the honor. The Dendrophoria's genius was its visceral duality. The same tree that symbolized Attis's death also carried the promise of resurrection, its burning ashes scattered on fields to ensure spring's return. A 4th-century poet captured the paradox. They drag it as a corpse, yet water it like a child. In a single act, Cybele's followers transformed grief into fertility, despair into hope, and a simple pine into the axis between worlds. To witness it wasn't just to watch a ritual, it was to see myth made flesh, sap, and smoke. The torchbearer's lungs burned as he sprinted uphill, his bare feet slapping against cold stone while the flame in his grip spat embers into the darkness. This wasn't just a race, it was the Lampedromia, a deadly relay where the flickering fire in each runner's hand carried more than light. It held the stolen spark of Prometheus himself, a living fragment of divine knowledge passed from flesh to flesh in a fragile, furious chain. These midnight races honored 2 contradictory powers: Prometheus, who gifted fire to humanity, and Hecate, who ruled the shadowy crossroads where such gifts blurred into curses. Ancient inscriptions from Athens describe the ritual's precise rules. Torches had to be lit from a single sacred flame, often kindled by friction or sunlight focused through crystals. The first runner would plunge his torch into this primal source, then sprint toward the next teammate, transferring the fire with a touch so precise that even a moment's hesitation could extinguish it. The stakes weren't just victory or shame. Many believed the dying of a torch mid-race signaled the gods' disapproval, dooming the entire team to misfortune. But the true genius of the Lampedromia lay in its dual nature. The race wasn't run on flat tracks but winding uphill paths mimicking Prometheus's climb to Olympus, each turn marked with shrines where runners had to briefly halt and offer prayers. A 5th-century vase painting shows a team straining toward a hilltop altar, their torches forming a zigzagging line of fire like a serpent ascending, a visual nod to the myth that Prometheus hid his stolen flame in a hollow fennel stalk, its segmented shape echoing the relay's passing of the light. The most chilling variation came in Hecate's honor, where runners raced not toward a finish line, but into graveyards or abandoned crossroads. Here, the final torchbearer would plant their flame in the earth as an offering, then flee without looking back, a reenactment of Hecate's mythic delivery of fire to the dead. Pausanias describes teams drawing lots for this dreaded position, as the tomb runner was said to carry the whispers of spirits back with him. Excavations near Corinth uncovered a racetrack leading straight into a necropolis, its stone markers carved with warnings: run swift, burn bright, speak never. What made these races revolutionary was their inversion of Greek athletic ideals. Unlike the Olympics' emphasis on individual glory, the Lampedromia demanded perfect synergy, a team moving as a single organism keeping the flame alive. Plutarch recounts a disastrous race where one runner stumbled, only for his teammate to leap forward and reignite the torch from his own tunic, burning himself terribly but preserving the sacred fire. Such acts weren't just bravery, they were theology in motion, proving humanity's determination to keep enlightenment alive against all odds. Modern recreations reveal the race's brutal physics. Bronze torches weighed nearly 10 pounds, their flames consuming oxygen quickly as runners sprinted. teams trained by racing through smoke-filled tunnels to simulate the choking haze of Prometheus's torment. Yet the real challenge was psychological, the terror of being the weak link in a chain stretching back to the gods. A Spartan training manual advised runners to bite their tongues until they tasted blood, using pain to focus their minds on the flame's fragility. The Lampedromia's legacy flickers in surprising places. The Olympic torch relay is its direct descendant, though sanitized of danger and divinity. More eerily, neuroscientists note how the race's combination of exhaustion, hypoxia, and flickering light could induce visions, perhaps explaining ancient accounts of runners seeing specters keeping pace with them. A first-century physician's journal found in Ephesus describes treating a Lampedromia participant who swore he'd seen Prometheus himself running beside him, his liver already pecked raw by the celestial eagle. Perhaps the most poignant relics are the broken torch handles found in Eleusis, their ends still sticky with pine resin. Unlike victory trophies, these were buried near the race's endpoints, silent witnesses to the cult's central truth, that knowledge, like fire, can't truly be owned. It must be seized, carried at great cost, and passed forward before the darkness swallows it. The race wasn't won when the flame reached the altar. It was won every time it didn't go out. The basket wobbled precariously as the girl adjusted her grip, her knuckles white beneath the woven reeds. Inside lay something neither she nor any other participant in the Orphic was ever permitted to see, a mystery wrapped in linen, its shape indistinguishable through the tight weave. This wasn't just a ceremonial burden. It was a covenant of silence where the penalty for a single curious peek wasn't scolding or shame, but execution. Athenian girls as young as 7 carried these baskets through the city's backstreets under cover of night, their route carefully planned to avoid prying eyes, their cargo known only to the priestesses who packed them. What made these rites so perilously sacred? The objects inside, referred to only as areta, meaning things unspeakable, were believed to hold the power of both fertility and ruin. Some scholars speculate they contained phallic symbols or figs representing Demeter's bounty, while others argue for miniature effigies of underworld deities. A fragment from a lost play by Euripides teasingly describes them as what no man may know and no woman may tell, suggesting even the initiates themselves were kept in deliberate ignorance. The ritual's potency depended on this enforced mystery, the idea that some truths were too volatile to be looked at directly, only carried in trust. The procession followed a strict choreography of concealment. Girls wore veils that obscured their faces, and their baskets were layered with false bottoms in case of accidental drops. Ancient courtroom records from Athens mention a slave who claimed to have glimpsed an areton when a basket tore. Her subsequent execution was swift, with the court citing an offense against the city's divine shield. This wasn't merely punishment, it was a grim reminder that the ritual's secrecy wasn't just tradition, but a safeguard. The objects were thought to be so charged with power that uncontrolled exposure could blight crops, dry up wells, or worse. Yet the Orphic's brilliance lay in its psychological alchemy. By entrusting young girls with such grave responsibility, the rite transformed them from children into vessels of the divine. A recovered hymn describes the moment the baskets were handed over as a second birth, where the girls' voices dropped to whispers and their footsteps grew light as if walking between worlds. The physical burden mirrored the metaphysical one. What they carried was heavy, not just in weight but in consequence. Archaeology offers tantalizing clues. Excavations near the Acropolis revealed a cache of miniature baskets buried with their contents intact, but when opened, they held only dust, as if the objects inside had dissolved over time. More telling are the pottery fragments showing veiled girls with baskets, their eyes downcast not in submission but fierce concentration. One vase even depicts a dropped basket with a serpent coiling from its broken lid, a visual warning of what might escape if secrecy failed. The ritual's legacy lingers in unexpected ways. modern psychoanalysts compare it to childhood trauma studies, where the not knowing becomes its own kind of initiation. And perhaps that was the point all along, to teach that some mysteries aren't meant to be solved, only carried. As the last participant in each procession would whisper to the next before vanishing into the dark, what you hold is less important than the fact that you held it. In a world obsessed with revelation, the Orphic dared to worship the unseen. The initiates knelt naked in the underground Mithraeum, their faces hidden behind heavy lion masks of hammered bronze. The air reeked of damp earth and burning frankincense as the priest circled them with a honey jar in hand, the golden syrup glistening like liquid fire in the flickering torchlight. This wasn't ceremonial play acting, it was the Leontica, one of Mithraism's most brutal rites of passage, where candidates weren't just compared to lions. They were expected to become them, purging their humanity in a trial by sweetness and flame. The masks weren't mere costumes. Designed with hinged jaws that clamped shut, they forced initiates to breathe through tiny nose holes, simulating the suffocating heat of a lion's den. Ancient graffiti found in Ostia's Mithraeum depicts these masks with solar rays radiating from their manes, a nod to the cult's belief that lion men carried fragments of the sun god's essence. But the true ordeal began when priests poured honey over the masks' eye holes, nostrils, and mouth slits, first a trickle, then a torrent. The sticky flood blinded and choked the candidates, who were forbidden to cough or wipe it away. A recovered Mithraic hymn describes the sensation as the fire of the soul made thick, the honey representing both the sweetness of divine knowledge and the suffocating weight of carrying it. Why honey? Mithraic cosmology held that lions were celestial creatures, their fiery nature making them guardians of the sun's path. Honey, with its golden hue and preservative qualities, symbolized immortality but also danger. Too much would drown, just enough would purify. A 2nd century instructional text from Rome warns priests to watch for initiates who thrashed violently versus those who sat still. The former lacked the lion's patience needed for higher mysteries. Those who passed were said to taste the honey as wine upon their tongues, a sign Mithras had transformed their suffering into sacrament. The ritual's cruel brilliance lay in its sensory overload. Between the mask's metal grip on the skull, the honey sealing every orifice, and the priest's rhythmic chanting of Nama, Nama, praise, praise, initiates often hallucinated. Some described seeing Mithras himself appear as a golden-maned beast, licking the honey from their faces like a lion grooming its cub. Others recalled entering a trance where time unraveled minutes stretched into hours, and the honey's drip became the slow pulse of the cosmos itself. Modern neurologists suggest the masks may have induced hypoxia, intensifying these visions while mimicking the fiery breath Mithraic texts associate with enlightenment. Archaeological finds reveal how meticulously staged these ordeals were. At a Mithraeum in Capua, excavators uncovered lion masks with interior grooves designed to channel honey away from the nose at precise angles, preventing actual suffocation. Nearby, stone benches bore deep claw marks not from animals, but from initiates' fingernails as they gripped the edges during the ordeal. Most haunting are the tiny honey pots buried in niches, some still bearing fingerprints in their beeswax seals. The final test came when priests finally removed the masks. Initiates were expected to lick the honey from each other's faces in a grotesque mimicry of lion cubs feeding, their tongues scraping away the residue of their shared trial. This act of mutual purification bound them as a pride, not just to each other but to Mithras's celestial hunt. A mosaic from a London Mithraeum shows initiates in this moment, their human features emerging from beneath lion visages, eyes wide with something between terror and triumph. What unsettled Roman observers wasn't the ritual's violence, but its effectiveness. Military officers who underwent the Leontica reportedly displayed preternatural calm in battle, their faces streaked with honey and soot like war paint. A recovered letter from a skeptical senator admits that after witnessing the rite, he could no longer look at lions in the arena without seeing something older than Rome staring back. The cult's genius was in its literalism. By enduring the lion's trials, initiates didn't just worship the sun's power. They stole fragments of it, carrying the burnished light of Mithras in their honey-sticky throats. The crowd's murmurs turned to gasps as the masked figures burst into the torchlit square, their rough hands clamping over the chosen girl's mouth before she could scream. Dragged kicking toward a waiting chariot, her saffron robe tearing on the cobblestones, she vanished into the night just as Persephone had been swallowed by the earth. But this abduction was no real crime. It was meticulously staged theater, a sacred deception performed by Eleusinian priests to plunge initiates into Demeter's mythic grief. These mock kidnappings weren't random acts of terror. They followed an ancient script etched into temple walls, the victim always a maiden of high birth, the captors dressed as underworld shades, the pursuit route tracing the supposed path Hades took when he stole Persephone. For days afterward, her family and neighbors would enact Demeter's desperate search, overturning jars as if the girl might be hiding inside, digging at crossroads where spirits were thought to linger, even wading into the sea to beg the nymphs for clues. The ritual's genius lay in its emotional alchemy. By living the goddess's anguish firsthand, participants didn't just hear about resilience, they forged it through collective despair. Ancient accounts reveal startling details about the kidnapping staging. The victim was secretly coached for weeks, learning to mimic Persephone's legendary resistance without truly fighting back. A recovered priest's manual from Eleusis specifies exact pressure points to restrain her without bruising, and how to muffle her cries so they'd carry just far enough to horrify onlookers without alerting outsiders. The chariot's wheels were wrapped in rags to muffle its escape, leaving only a trail of crushed asphodel flowers, the bloom sacred to Hades, most chilling. The girl's mother was never forewarned. Her raw shock when the abduction unfolded was essential to the ritual's power. For 7 days and nights, the community reenacted Demeter's mourning with eerie precision. Women stopped grinding grain, letting flour cakes rot in their ovens. Men doused hearth fires, plunging homes into unseasonal cold. Even children participated, piling their toys at temple steps as offerings to coax Persephone's return. The message was visceral: when one suffers, the whole world stagnates. A votive plaque from the sanctuary shows a woman tearing at her hair, not in sorrow but anger, a radical departure from typical depictions of grieving mothers. This was no passive lament. It was a demand for justice, channeling Demeter's legendary fury when she froze the earth in retaliation. The climax came when the abducted girl suddenly reappeared, not at the temple gates, but in the town's central threshing floor, kneeling amid piles of harvested grain with pomegranate juice staining her lips. Her first words were always the same: "I have seen what lies beneath." This wasn't mere pageantry. By placing her amidst the harvest, the priests underscored the ritual's deepest lesson: that resilience isn't born from avoiding darkness, but from returning from it transformed. The grain at her feet symbolized both Persephone's cyclical rebirth and the hard truth that wisdom often requires first being shattered. Modern archaeology confirms how widespread these mock abductions were. Small clay dolls with articulated limbs, likely used to demonstrate restraint techniques, have been found in priestly residences near Eleusis. Even more telling are the hundreds of miniature torches excavated from nearby homes, identical to those used in the search processions. Their soot patterns suggest they were deliberately extinguished and relit at specific intervals, mimicking Demeter's moment of hope when Hecate's torch revealed Persephone's fate. The psychological brilliance of these rites lay in their controlled trauma. Unlike other mysteries that used hallucinogens or pain to induce transcendence, the staged kidnapping leveraged communal empathy as the catalyst. When the girl finally returned, it wasn't just her family who wept with relief. The entire polis shared in the catharsis. A recovered letter from a 4th century initiate describes watching her own daughter undergo the ritual decades later, confessing she finally understood why Demeter's story was never just about loss. To witness the stolen return is to know the world can mend. Even the broken. What made these mock abductions endure for centuries wasn't their spectacle, but their subversive empathy. In a society where women's pain was often silenced, the rites temporarily centered it as the axis around which all life revolved. The message resonated far beyond Eleusinian frescoes in Pompeii, show similar abduction scenes, and even early Christian writers borrowed the motif for allegories of resurrection. Yet the original ritual's power lay in its refusal to offer easy answers. The returned girl never spoke of her days in hiding. The pomegranate stains a silent reminder that some wounds and wisdom can't be shared, only carried, and perhaps that was the point all along. The initiates stood trembling as the priest dipped their white robes into vats of molten gold, or so it seemed. The liquid wasn't metal, but something far more precious. Saffron threads steeped until they bled their essence into boiling water, transforming plain linen into garments that glowed like captured sunlight. This was the Krokosis, a rite where Dionysus's followers didn't just wear yellow. They became living emblems of the god's most paradoxical gift, the clarity found at the bottom of a cup. Saffron wasn't chosen at random. Painstakingly harvested from crocus stamens, each thread represented hours of labor. A single pound required 70,000 flowers. By staining robes with this liquid gold, the cult enacted a brutal metaphor. Enlightenment demanded sacrifice. Ancient dyeing manuals found in Thesmophoria reveal initiates had to gather the crocuses themselves, their fingertips cracked from dawn harvests before they even approached the vats. The physical toll mirrored Dionysus's mythic suffering, torn apart by titans, yet reborn through his own spilled blood. The dyeing process itself was ritual theater. Robes were submerged not in silence, but to the shriek of alloy pipes mimicking the cries of the nymph Crocus, who according to myth was transformed into the first saffron plant after her love affair with Hermes ended tragically. As the fabric darkened from pale lemon to deep amber, priests chanted verses about Dionysus's birth from Zeus's thigh, the golden womb that shielded him from Hera's wrath. The parallels were deliberate. Just as the god was twice born, so too were the initiates, emerging from the dye vats with skin pruned like newborns. But the true shock came when the robes dried. Under sunlight, the saffron emitted an eerie luminescence, giving wearers an unnatural glow. Byzantine texts describe drunkards mistaking initiates for actual deities in torchlight, prostrating themselves in the streets. This wasn't just coloration, it was alchemy. The dye's key compound, crocin, contains psychoactive properties when absorbed through skin, inducing mild euphoria. Worshippers literally felt their enlightenment intensify as the fabric warmed against their bodies during frenzied dances. Archaeologists have unearthed vats in Macedonia still stained orange after 2 millennia, their sides etched with Dionysian imagery. More telling are the tiny crocus motifs woven into the robe's hems, not as decoration but as reminders that enlightenment, like saffron, is fleeting. The color faded within months, forcing initiates to repeat the ritual annually. A recovered hymn puts it bluntly: the god's gold washes from your back just as wisdom slips from a sober mind. What made the Krokosis revolutionary was its inversion of traditional Greek values. While philosophers sought truth through reason, Dionysus's followers found it through sensory overwhelm. The stinging scent of saffron, the fabric's irritating itch against sweat-slicked skin, the creeping euphoria as crocin entered their bloodstream. A Spartan polemarch once sneered that the cult drank through their pores, missing the point entirely. The robes weren't just symbols, they were delivery systems for transcendence, each fading thread a lesson in holding tight to what ultimately cannot be kept. The ritual's legacy lingers in unexpected places. Modern lab studies show saffron compounds genuinely enhance serotonin uptake. But the ancients needed no spectrophotometers to understand the deeper truth. Sometimes, to see the light, you must first steep yourself in gold and let it stain your very bones. The cave exhaled a breath thick with sulfur as the Pythia shuffled toward the tripod, her bare feet finding purchase on the uneven stone floor. The air smelled of wet stone and something sharper crushed laurel leaves, their narcotic oils already clinging to her tongue. This was no casual meditation. Before uttering a single prophecy, she'd chew handfuls of those glossy green leaves, their toxins sending her body into spasms that shook the very tripod upon which she perched. To the pilgrims waiting outside, her convulsions weren't signs of poisoning, they were proof the god had entered her. Laurel wasn't just sacred to Apollo, it was his literal mouthpiece. Ancient texts describe how priests at Delphi cultivated a special variety called the Daphne pharmaceutia. Its leaves laced with cyanogenic compounds that, when chewed, induced hallucinations, numbness, and uncontrollable tremors. Modern botanists confirm the presence of prussic acid in certain laurel species, a chemical that disrupts oxygen flow to the brain, creating the sensation of floating or divine possession. The Pythia didn't merely interpret visions, she fought for each gasping breath between prophecies, her lips flecked with green foam as Apollo's voice ripped through her. The process was meticulously staged to amplify these effects. After days of fasting on barley and water, the priestess would descend into the Aditon, the temple's innermost chamber where volcanic fumes seeped from cracks in the stone. There, seated above the legendary omphalos, she'd begin masticating laurel while attendants fanned the leaves sent toward her face. A recovered priest's manual from Delphi details how initiates were trained to chew in rhythmic bursts, 3 steady crushes to release the oils, then a pause to swallow the bitter sap. The goal wasn't subtle intoxication, but total somatic surrender. Plutarch, who served at Delphi, wrote of one Pythia who thrashed so violently her hair came undone, the laurel wreath tumbling into the sacrificial fire below with a hiss. What made this ritual terrifyingly effective was its duality. The same convulsions that signaled divine contact also prevented deception. No one could fake such bodily trauma. Pilgrims heard prophecies punctuated by the Pythia's retching, her words slurred but piercing. A Spartan general's account describes seeking counsel before battle and watching in horror as the priestess's eyes rolled back, her neck tendons standing rigid as she rasped. The wolf's shadow lengthens at noon. He interpreted this as a warning to attack at midday and credited the bizarre advice with his victory. Archaeology confirms the laurel's centrality. Excavations at Delphi uncovered ceramic trays with tooth marks, their surfaces still sticky with plant resins. More telling are the tiny laurel leaf impressions found pressed into clay tablets bearing Apollo's prophecies, as if the very paper of the divine was poisoned. But the most haunting evidence comes from the Pythia's skeletal remains analyzed in 2016. Her teeth showed unusual wear patterns consistent with decades of grinding fibrous leaves, while cervical vertebrae bore signs of chronic whiplash, a life spent oscillating between ecstasy and agony. The genius of the ritual lay in its cruel authenticity. While other oracles relied on obscure poetry, Delphi's prophecies emerged from visible suffering, their truth confirmed by the priestess's wrecked body. A 1st-century poet noted the paradox: the god speaks clearest when his vessel is broken. In a world hungry for certainty, the laurel's toxicity wasn't a side effect, it was the sacrament. Every convulsion, every froth-filled syllable proved Apollo's voice could shatter mortal limits, if only for the time it took the poison to burn itself out. The ropes creaked under their weight as the girls swung violently through the air, their sandals skimming the tops of blooming almond trees. This was no child's game, it was the Iora, a ritual so unsettling that even ancient Athenians whispered about its origins. Each spring, young women were suspended from ropes tied to tree branches, their bodies twisting like human fruit as onlookers showered them with petals and curses in equal measure. To modern eyes, it might look like festive play, but the wooden swings weren't just tools of motion. They were instruments of transformation, meant to purge the city's collective guilt through a spectacle of near-death exhilaration. The ritual's origins were shrouded in ominous legend. Some claimed it reenacted the suicide of Eragon, a maiden who hanged herself from a tree after her father's wrongful execution. Others whispered of darker roots, ancient substitute sacrifices where victims once swung from nooses until their necks snapped, their deaths ensuring fertile harvests. By classical times, the ropes had grown longer, the drops more perilous, but the echo of that primordial violence remained. Girls wore special belts called strophions that dug into their ribs with every arc, a visceral reminder that purification required discomfort bordering on harm. The higher the swing, the louder the crowd cheered, believing each dizzying ascent carried away another fragment of the city's corruption. What made the aura uniquely chilling was its blend of joy and jeopardy. Swings were set up over cliffs or rocky outcrops, with priests calculating the rope's length so the girls' heels would graze the danger zone at the lowest point. Ancient vases depict the scene in eerie detail. One shows a swing's wooden seat cracking mid-arc, the girl's face frozen between terror and ecstasy as she plunges toward but never quite into the abyss. This wasn't mere theatrics. The near misses were essential, simulating the razor's edge between life and death where divine intervention was thought to occur. Participants later described entering a trance where time slowed, the world blurring into streaks of sky and earth as if they'd momentarily slipped the bonds of mortality. Archaeologists have found unsettling evidence of the ritual's darker past. At a shrine near Mount Hymettus, excavators uncovered child-sized leather harnesses fitted with lead weights, tools likely used to train younger initiates for the swing's G-forces. Even more telling are the fragments of a lost play by Sophocles that describe Athenian elders debating whether to restore the old ways during a plague, hinting at a time when the swings didn't stop at mere dizziness. The ritual's evolution from human sacrifice to symbolic ordeal mirrors Greece's broader shift from brutality to coded ceremony, yet the shadow of the noose still swayed in the background. The aura's true power lay in its communal catharsis. As the girls swung, crowds would pelt them with figs and crushed violets, symbols of fertility and sorrow, while chanting, "Shake off the evil." The motion wasn't random. Priests dictated specific arcs said to mirror the Earth's wobble on its axis, a celestial cleanse for terrestrial sins. When the ropes finally stilled, participants were given honey cakes shaped like nooses, a sweet yet grim reminder that redemption always hangs by a thread. Modern thrill seekers might recognize the ritual's legacy in amusement park rides or bungee jumping, the same primal cocktail of fear and euphoria. But the aura wasn't entertainment. It was a collective exorcism where a city's sins were entrusted to the trembling hands of girls who dangled between heaven and earth, their swinging bodies scribing invisible prayers into the air. Every shriek, every snapped petal, every heart-stopping moment when a sandal slipped was part of the spell. And when their feet finally touched solid ground, it wasn't just the girls who stepped back changed. It was all of Athens, lighter now, as if the ropes had swung away something unseen but deeply felt. The almonds bloomed heavier that year, the wine tasted sweeter, and for a brief, shining season, the city dared to believe it was clean. From blood-drinking rites to sacred swings that dangled initiates between life and death, the mystery cults of ancient Greece didn't just push boundaries, they shattered them. These 30 practices reveal a world where devotion wasn't about quiet prayer but visceral transformation, where worshippers swallowed hallucinogenic brews, handled venomous snakes, and even castrated themselves in pursuit of the divine. Each ritual, no matter how bizarre, served a razor-sharp purpose: to tear away the veil between mortal and God, if only for a heartbeat. Consider the contradictions. The same cults that preached purity forced initiates to wallow in decay, like the Thesmophoria's rotting piglets. Those promising enlightenment demanded brutal trials. Pythagoras' 5-year vow of silence, the Mithraic lion masks that drowned initiates in honey. And how do we reconcile the tender care given to Adonis's doomed gardens with the raw savagery of Dionysian homophagy, where devotees feasted on living flesh? The answer lies in the cult's defiance of easy categories. Terror wasn't the opposite of ecstasy, it was its twin flame. To these ancient seekers, the most profound truths weren't found in safety, but in surrender to forces that could uplift or annihilate. Now imagine standing at the crossroads of history. Which path would you choose? Would you dare the bull's blood drenches of Mithras, or let Hecate's spectral hounds guide you through midnight rituals? Could you stomach the galley's self-mutilation for Cybele, or would the Eleusinian mysteries' hallucinogenic Kykeon be your limit? There's no judgment here, only the thrill of peering into the abyss and wondering what stares back. These cults remind us that humanity's quest for meaning has always been messy, dangerous, and breathtakingly inventive. They shaped philosophies, inspired secret societies, and left echoes in everything from modern psychology to horror tropes. So the next time you smell burning herbs or hear a distant drumbeat, remember, the mysteries never truly vanished, they just learned new names. If unraveling history's enigmas fuels your curiosity, join us for more deep dives into the past. Like and subscribe to keep exploring the shadows where faith, fear, and the forbidden collide. The next revelation is waiting, and trust us, it's stranger than fiction.